Om Sadashiva Samarambam Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Okay, so we are back with Drg Drsya-Viveka, our second class. On the previous class, we got through the introduction and the verse 1, and we stopped at the note which says that the Upanishads are the base for this text, Vedantic text, Drg Drsya, and there is a mention here to Kena Upanishads, in which a student asks the guru, willed by whom does the mind fall on objects as thoughts of objects? So, willed by whom does the mind fall as it is forced by this power? Yeah? Direct by whom does the main prana function? Willed by whom do the people utter this speech? Which effulgent principle indeed directs the eyes and the ears? So this is a famous passage of one of our Upanishads, and most probably you all heard about that. We know that we have the sense organs, we have the five sense instruments, the five sense organs, but they are empowered by something which allows the eyes to see, the ear to hear, the skin to touch, the nose to smell. There is something that empower the body-mind complex, in a way that it concedes or lends existence and consciousness, sentience to this machinery, human machinery, in a way that the human machinery appears to be a sentient being, So, and we have seen as well that there is a transfer of sentience, a transfer of light, a transfer of existence, which goes from one illuminator to another illuminator, and then to another illuminator, until the body appears as if it has its own light, because it appears as consciousness and existence, a sentient being that is conscious of its own existence. So the body itself is the end of the line, let's say. It appears to be animate and appears to be the illuminator and the seer. And there is a transfer there. We saw that in the introduction, and we also, if you remember well, we mentioned that this transfer is gradual, and it has to go from one illuminator to another illuminator to another illuminator until we have the body appearing as the seer and the illuminator. Okay, so we have touched that, and there is this power by whom the mind, the sense organs, and the speech, and the eyes and the ears, everything functions. The Upanishads are the basis for Bharata Tirtha to write the verse on this text. That invisible landing principle is called the self, Atma, the conscious existence principle. So we're going to stay more with conscious aspect, because we are analyzing the aspect of Brahman which illumines and reveals, okay? And the aspect of Brahman that illumines and reveals is the Chit aspect, the consciousness aspect, okay? It's going to produce the seer, the experiencer, and the illuminator, okay? And we're going to try to understand from where that original light comes from. That invisible landing principle is called Atma, or the self, the conscious principle. The author will call it Sakshi or Chit. So Chit and Sakshi. Sakshi is another name for consciousness, or Chit as well, another name for consciousness, the Chit, the conscious aspect, the conscious nature or aspect of Brahman. It is this Atma, this self, this Brahman, that is lending consciousness to all the three components of the body, sense, mind complex. Okay, so now we are dividing the body in three aspects. We would imagine that it's something closer to the three bodies. No, it's not. So we are looking at the body-mind complex from the physical standpoint, because the body, the physical aspect of our human expression, this physical aspect appears as having its own sentience, or its own light, its own ability to see, because we see through the physical eyes, and the physical eyes are part of the physical body. So it has, here is divided into three aspects, three components. How does consciousness, this Sakshi, Chaitanya, or Chit, lends its consciousness to this body-mind complex, which was divided in these three aspects? On the most dense is the physical body, and then we move into the subtle body, and we find two aspects of the seer, of the illuminator, of the experience, which is the sense organs. And then we have another aspect, which is the mind. And we could also add another aspect as the intellect, okay? So we could, in fact, divide this into five components, okay? Which is the physical, and then the sense organs, and then the mind, the intellect, and then consciousness itself, the Sakshi Chaitanya. How does this transfer or lending happens? We know that there is a transfer. I think transfer is a good word as well. There is a transfer or a lending. It can be done directly and can be done indirectly. So we have seen that the light, I would say, the subtle body, the consciousness is going to infuse this physical body with animation and with sentience and with existence, living existence, but it does not do directly. There is a transfer. And what does Sakshi Chaitanya do? It transfers its sentience, its Chit aspect, its Sakshi aspect, transfers where? Transfers to the subtle body. And then the subtle body is going to transfer to the physical body. And then we have a gradual landing or transfer, or indirectly transfer or landing. The indirect landing is a series of exchanges involve one or two or many intermediaries. Okay. So it says that it is a transfer or exchange involves sometimes 1, 2, 3, 4, howsoever we want to break it into, and then we see that one aspect of these components, one aspect of our human expression, human machinery, is going to keep transferring the same way the intellect is going to transfer, sentience to the mind. The mind is going to transfer, to something which is a little bit denser than the mind, which is the sense organs. The sense organs is going to transfer its sentience to the instruments of knowledge, perception, which is part of the physical body. So there is a gradual, direct and indirect, and we're going to see which transfer is direct and which transfer is indirect. But it's easy to understand that consciousness, Chit, cannot transfer consciousness directly to the body without transferring first to these intermediary components or parts or aspects that are going to be passing it on until it reaches the body, and then the body appears as a sentient living being. The indirect landing is a series of exchanges involving one or two or many intermediaries. In the case of the self, Atma, Sakshi lending consciousness to the mind. So we know it begins with Chit or Sakshi or consciousness. It lends consciousness to whom? To the subtle body. We could look at it and say we lend it to the I thought. The mind we could see as all other thoughts that somehow cluster or exists around the I thought. The I thought is the subject Jivatma, and then around the Aham thought, that is Idam, everything that I perceive around me. So it transfers to the I thought, and then the I thought is going to transfer sentience to the thoughts, feelings, and emotions that occur. And then this mind itself is going to transfer sentience to the sense organs. Okay, so the first transfer comes from consciousness itself. And when it happens, when it lands to the intellect, let's say, or to the mind, howsoever we want to see it, it does indirectly, let's say. If we remove the intellect from the picture, it transfers to the subtle body directly. There is no intermediary component or medium. It transfers direct. But once consciousness wants to reach the sense organs, it cannot do it directly. It needs to do via the mind. You understand? It's all very simple. So in the case of self-landing consciousness, how does it happen? The author says that it's not directly. So it's directly from consciousness to the mind. So, and then, but it's not direct to the sense organs. It goes indirectly. How does this happen? The author says that it's not directly happening, but it's in the form of a gradual transference, stage by stage. Atma lends consciousness to the mind directly. Okay. So there it's directly transferred. Consciousness is going to pervade the subtle body, and then it's going to be transferring directly this conscious chit aspect of Brahman directly to the subtle body, as we know. It never, though, lends consciousness or transfers consciousness directly to the sense organs, as we know. Thus, consciousness becomes the illuminator, and the mind becomes the illuminated. So, it's a concept that we know very well. We have seen it in Panchadas. We call consciousness or awareness the light of the illuminator. When we say the light of the illuminator is the absolute or the first illuminator, okay? So it is the number one, let's say, or the number 3 or 4. There will be different, I would say, exposition here, putting some numbers as well that may be a little bit confusing, because I would call Chit or consciousness the number 1 illuminator, but it goes other way around. The author puts it, the number 1 is the body, the instruments of perception, of seeing and experience, but it does not matter. We can see from different structures, So we have this Atma becomes the illuminator and the mind the illuminate. But we know that for the Jiva Atma, the real experience in knowing entity, consciousness cannot really alone illumines Jiva Atma's environment, okay? Although it illumines, okay, but it does not illumine for the Jiva Atma, because the Jiva Atma is going to illumine its environment by receiving this consciousness from Sakshi Chaitanya, and then becoming a reflective consciousness, or becoming, the mind. And then the mind is going to do what? It's going to transfer this power of illuminating to the sense organ. The sense organs are going to transfer this power of illumination to the body, or to the sense instruments. So we have these gradual transfers, okay? So Atma becomes the illuminator number one, or the absolute illuminator, whereas the mind becomes the illuminated, okay? So now Atma, or the self, or Sakshi, is the seer, is the absolute seer, although it's not an experiencing entity, but it is the absolute seer. And then it transfers the power of seeing. That's why when I unfold this teaching in Portuguese, I like to bring the intellect, because when we see from the angle of the seer and the seen, is the intellect is the real seer, because as we know, the intellect witness the mind, witness thoughts, feelings, and emotions, okay? But the intellect has the power to see it, but he gets this power from consciousness alone, and consciousness, which is the absolute seer, it's not an experiencing seer. It transfers to the intellect the seeing power, this witnessing power, in a way that the intellect becomes the knowing experience seer. So we are talking in two languages here. One is the illuminator, or the perceiver, or the seer. Okay, seer is a nice way to put it, because the eyes see but what kind of power allows the eyes to see? So all of that is traced back to the absolute illuminator, the absolute experience, the absolute knower, and the absolute seer, which is, by the way, not an experiencing entity. Okay, I like to make it a point. It becomes an experiencing entity, seeing the world through these other aspects of its structure, through the sense organs, sense instruments, and so on, the mind, sense organs. It sees through this transfer, this gradual transfers of sentience, but it depends on the absolute seer coming from consciousness awareness, which is not an experiencing entity. When the mind becomes illumined or sentient, the mind gets the capacity to what? To transfer this sentience or consciousness to the sense organs. So the sense organs, as we know, is integral part of the mind. The mind is this complex organism, or the subtle body, and it has even the pranas there. Okay, the pranas are there, which is not going to be seen as one of the seers, because the pranas, they are intelligent design, but they are not really witnessing or seeing phenomenon. It's the keeper of the body-mind complex. When the mind becomes illuminated or sentient, the mind gets its capacity. It receives this consciousness, and then it transfers or lends consciousness to the sense organs. The mind gives consciousness to the sense organs, and thus the mind becomes the illuminator, and the sense organs become the illumined. So now we have the sense organ that appears to have consciousness of its own, because it has a sentience, but it's receiving it from another subtle aspect of the subtle body we call mind, okay, which is basically the intellect, I would say, or howsoever we want to call it. The mind gives the mind gives sense organs, and thus the mind becomes the illuminator, and the sense organs become the illumined. The sense organs lend consciousness to the sense instruments, as we know that. Now we have the sense instruments, our physical eyes, ear, nose, and tongue, and skin all over the body. This is the physical, the physical body. So the sense organs are going to do what? It's going to infuse the physical sense instruments in a way that the physical sense instruments, they are infused with life, and then they appear to be self-sentient, self-conscious, self-aware. But no, it is again a transfer, gradual transfer that begins from awareness or consciousness alone. Okay. So does the sense organs become the illuminator, and the body becomes illuminated by the sense organs, and through the body which appears to be illumined, through this body that appears to be the seer, appears to be the illuminator, the external world get illumined. Now the external world is being illumined by the Jivatma, the body of the Jivatma, in this succession of transfers of what begins in Chaitanya, consciousness. The mind in this case, the author says that the self, Atma, is Drg, and the mind is Drishan. Okay, so the mind is also Drg. Before it says that Atma is Drg, the seer, and the mind is Drishan. Atma is the illuminator, and the mind is illumined. Now it says, but the mind is also Drg. The mind is also the seer, and the mind is also the illuminator. And in this context, the sense organs become the Drishan, becomes the illumined, and becomes the seen. Okay? And then sense organs become the seer, and the sense instruments, the body becomes the seen. So the sense organs becomes the illuminator, and the sense instruments are illumined by the illuminator in this sequential transfer of sentience. That's why, thus, in the form of gradual flow, Atma illumines the whole world. The whole world is illumined by Atma. So we have those different analogies. One of them would be the sunlight hitting 1, 2, 3 mirrors before bringing some light rays into our bedroom so that we can read a book, for example. So there are transfers and transfers on some different mirrors or reflecting mediums. In this case, it's just transfers consciousness in a magical, beautiful way to these different levels of density, from the subtler to the little bit denser, a little bit denser, a little bit denser, until our physical instruments of knowledge experience, they are enlivened with the same consciousness. Thus, in the form of a gradual flow, consciousness illumines the entire world. That's why when the intermediaries in this flow are absent, like when the mind and sense organs are absent, consciousness does not manage to illumine the external world, because consciousness cannot direct experience the external world. Okay, so consciousness cannot experience and know the external world, cannot see, cannot illumine. It requires an agent, an experiencing agent. It requires the Jiva Atma, and in these different aspects of its construct. Okay, that's why when the intermediaries are not there, consciousness cannot really illumine the world. This consciousness does not directly experience the external world. Consciousness cannot directly illumine the world. If you take the intermediaries, every intermediary has a twofold. If you take the intermediary, and then when we pull every one of these illuminators or seers aspect, when we take one by one, each one of them is both, is seer and seen. You're getting the concept. Every one of them is seen by a higher or subtler principle, and it sees whatsoever is below itself. Like the body is seeing the world, the physical instruments of perception, seeing the world, but it's seen and it is illumined as well, and it's illumined by the sense organs. And the sense organs, they become the illuminator of the world, of the sense instruments, but they are illumined by the mind. The mind is illumined by the intellect. And so all of these intermediary seers or illuminators, they have double status of seer and status of seeing, status of illuminator and status of illumined. So far, so good, Karen? Mark? Then we have the classic analogy. on a full moon. So all of these intermediaries has a twofold start. On a full moon night, the sun illumines the moon. The sun is the illuminator and the moon is illumined. Even as the moon becomes illumined, it gets the status of illuminator and it's capable of illumining the earth. So in a full moon night, the sun cannot illumine directly our transactions in our, depending on the position. So can it illumine directly? No. It has to illumine the moon, and then the moon is going to illumine, our nights. So now we have the moon as the illuminator, but when we carefully look into the status of illuminator of the moon, we will realize that the moon is also being illumined, although we can't see it. It gets the status of illuminator, and so is capable of illumining our earth. If I ask whether the moon is the illuminator and the illumined, what will be the answer? It is both. From the standpoint of the sun, the moon is what? Illumined. The moon is seen. The moon is illumined by the sun. But from the standpoint of the moon is the illuminator. And the moon is illumining the earth here, and the earth becomes illumined, seen by the light reflect by the moon. So it's both. From the standpoint is the moon is illumined. From the standpoint of the earth, the moon is the illuminator. How to differentiate between the illuminator sun and the illuminator moon? So what is the difference between these two illuminators? So one is a relative or secondary illuminator, and the other one is the absolute. So what is the status of the sun? The sun is going to illumine the moon is going to illumine the earth, but the sun is self-luminous, as we know. Is the sun illumined by any other principle? No, the sun is not illumined. Is the sun seen by any other principle? No. because it's self-luminous. It has its own source of illumination. So there is an absolute illuminator, and then there are intermediary or relative illuminators. Okay. How to differentiate between the illuminated sun and the illuminated moon? The sun is an illuminator without ever becoming illumined. So the sun can never be illumined. Why? It's useless, it's pointless. So it has a huge source of light. It does not require any source of light to reveal itself. That's the meaning of self-revealing. That's the meaning of these analogies in respect to self-knowledge. Is the knowledge of that which is self-revealing, self-luminous. So that's the case with this analogy. So the sun is self-luminous. It is never illuminated. It is a non-illumined illuminator. So now we have this concept. So there is something that is an illuminator without ever being illumined. So the sun, likewise, consciousness, chit, awareness, is illuminator, is a non-illumined illuminator. Okay, why? Because it's self-luminous, self-conscious, self-existent, is the only source of light, of consciousness and existence. Okay. The sun is what we call an absolute illuminator. It does not depend on anything. So another characteristic of being the absolute illuminator is the nature of this Chaitanya, this Sakshi, is independence. Because if you depend on other source of light, okay, you enjoy dependent status, okay, a dependent status as an illuminator, which is the case of the moon, which is the case of the subtle body. Excuse me, just for I have to put it on. Which is the case of the moon, the case of the subtle body, and every intermediary aspects in this process of transfer. So the sun is an absolute illuminator. The moon is not an absolute illuminator because it is not independent. It requires the sunlight in order to transfer it to the earth because it is an illumined illuminator. Okay, it does not have its own independent source. It is illumined and then it illumines. It is a illumined illuminator. So it's called a relative illuminator, a relative seer, okay, a relative perceiver. So all these relative seers, illuminator, perceivers is referring to what? To the Jiva Atma, okay, to the Jiva, the body-mind construct, which is the only instrument there is to experiencing the world, okay? So there is the absolute illuminator, which is not the Jiva Atma, but is Sakshi Chaitanya, Pura and pure consciousness. So they are all relative illuminators. The author says that Atma, consciousness, is the absolute seer because it is a self-effulgent illuminator. So it's the only source, and it's absolute, it's independent, does not require any other source. Therefore, it's self-luminous, self-effulgent. It is the absolute illuminator, the absolute seer, and never illumined by anything. Whereas the mind, the intellect, the mind, and the sense organs and the body are relative illuminators. Okay? Thus, every individual is a mixture of absolute and relative seer. This is very nice. We are getting more into the teaching. Every Jivatma, every individual is a mixture of Drg and Drsya, okay? We have both. We have the absolute seer and mix up with relative seers. We have this source of independent source of light, mix up with other elements or components which receives and passes on. So we have this mixture of Drg Drsya, seer and seen that becomes a seer, but enjoys this both status as seen and seer. And then we are nothing else but a composition of Drg and several Drishyas that enjoy both status as seer and seen. This is the first topic of Drg Drsya-Viveka. In the first 5 verses, Swami Paramarthananda says, the author presents this topic of how the individual is a mixture of the absolute illuminator called Sakshi and the relative illuminators called the mind, intellect, mind, sense organs, and physical body. This is the topic in the first 5 verses. Thereafter, the author will say that our problem is that what is our problem, which is called samsara, and what is the cause. So he's going to help us to understand what is samsara, why we suffer, and what is the cause of this suffering. And we can right away infer, which is mixing up Drg with Drsya, the absolute seer, with the intermediary seers. Now we know we tend to identify with the intellect, we identify with the mind, we identify with our sense organs, we even identify with our pranas, our Shakti, and we identify with the physical body. And this confusion between the absolute seer, the absolute illuminator, and the intermediary relative double agent seers is samsara. This confusion is samsara. The author will point out that mixing up the absolute and the relative illuminators is samsara, and also that sorting out the absolute seer, illuminator, out of these other intermediary seers needs to be done. Needs to be done if our goal is to undo this confusion, confusion of what? Of identity. But Vedanta is always about identity. If we identify with these intermediary seers, what happens to that, Claude? I'm identified with something which is not free and independent. Understand? So I am dependent on something that I have left out, which is the absolute illuminator. And then I will, no, I have my own source of illumination. I am the absolute illuminator. But it's not going to solve our problems, because soon enough we're going to understand that we are bound by time, and we are bound by not having our own source of conscious existence. And then the whole thing starts collapsing. Our confidence and our security and satisfaction begins collapsing. Look at the verse. The forms and colors of the external world. You all received the verse, right? The Cloud did a good work for us. So the first verse, he's going to review that first verse. The forms and colors of the external world, including the physical body, are experienced or seen objects. And the I is the seer and the experiencer and the illuminator, the subject, okay? So it begins that way, the first verse. We see colors and forms of the external world, and that includes what? For our surprise, oh my God, including my own body. So including my own nose, because I have a long nose, I can see my nose like that. So we can see everything. So we see, where am I? The verse says, colors and forms, which include our own body, are experienced and seen objects. And the eyes is the seer, or the seer subject, or the relative subject. The eyes themselves, though, are experienced and seen because its conditions are known to something else. Have you ever thought about that? The eyes, which appears to be the seer, see the world and see its own body complex, your physical body. It's seeing the world, it's seeing the body, but this is seen by something else, okay? And this something else is not something much abstract or anything. Is what? It's just the mind. And why we say that the mind sees the body? Because the mind knows of the body, okay? And it knows of its conditions. It knows of the conditions of the eyes. It knows when the eyes have a problem. So the eyes seeing the world are seen by the mind because the mind knows its condition. If it develops a certain illness, which prevents it from seeing things clearly, the mind is going to say, I see that my eyes are not doing well today. I must go and look for a doctor, right? So the eyes themselves are seen by something else, and this something else is the mind, and it would be the sense organs, and then the mind backing up the sense organs would come and conclude like, no, there is something I'm not seeing well. It's either with my physical eyes or it's something with my subtle eye, my organ of vision. But the mind is there objectifying the physical and the subtle, and the mind is the seer. So that's the point here. When the eyes themselves become drishan, seen, who is the experience of the eyes? No? The mind is the seer and the experiencer and the illuminer of the eyes, and the eyes become the seen object. The eyes were taking the status of being the seer, now it's seen by the mind. Even when the eyes are closed, the mind is capable of visualizing and imagining things. So this is a very interesting passage. Even when the eyes are closed, the mind is still able to imagine and see things in retrospect. Okay, the mind is much subtler. It knows its condition of the eyes. The eyes are seen by the mind, and the eyes can even, see through memories, things that the eyes have seen and was kept into one's memory files. Okay, and then can imagine and see. The mind is the seer. Even when the eyes are closed, the mind is capable of visualizing and imagining things. In fact, the mind knows that the eyes are closed. The eyes enjoy twofold status. It's seer and it's the seen. It illumines the world and it's illumined by the mind. It's seen by the mind. The eyes are relative seers. The eyes are relative seers. The mind is also not the absolute seer. Mental functions like thinking, doubting, worrying, etc., are entertained in the form of thoughts and are objects seen by another principle, right? So the mind is also not the absolute seer. Mental functions, which is functions of the mind, as we say, such as thoughts, feelings, emotions, all of that are seen, are experienced, are entertained in the form of thoughts and objects of experience. This is all objectified by what? is objectified by something else. The very conditions of the mind is very intimately experienced by us. We give expression to all our thoughts. We cannot do that if we do not experience them, and the thoughts are never inferred. Worry, knowledge, the understanding and no understanding functions, all of that is seen by us, let's say. We cannot do that. We give expression to all our soul. The very condition of the mind is very intimately experienced by something which we call a myself. We give expression to our thoughts. There is something about us that is objectifying and is even molding or shaping our thoughts. We cannot do that if we do not experience the thoughts, and the thoughts are never inferred. If they are inferred, we know the thoughts, we know the conditions of our mind. There is something other than that who experience the conditions of worry, of knowledge, and I don't understand, I understand. These aspects of the mind are directly experienced. That's why it's directly experienced. And I like to propose that the aspect of Jivatma that experience those conditions of the mind is the intellect, is the I thought, because Sakshi Chaitanya is not an experience, although it is the absolute light of the Illuminator, is the absolute seer, but it cannot see or experience and illuminate without those other intermediary transfers, let's say. So then it says here, the mind is the seer. The eyes are relative seers. The very condition of the mind, we cannot do that if we do not experience them and if the thoughts are never inferred. So, knowledge of the mind are directly experienced. The mind is Drishan. What is then the Drik? Okay, the question, the mind we have established that is being seen, illumined, and experienced and known. And then I say, what is the Drik that witness the mind? And here in the text, the author presents consciousness is the Drik. Okay, so we can see that the consciousness is what sees the mind, okay, and experience the mind. But as we know, consciousness is not an experiencing entity. That's why I felt inclined last time to introduce the intellect as the intermediary component that witness and experience the conditions of the mind on an experiential level, okay? Knowing, experiencing level. If the mind is the Drishan, what is the Drik? We could say the intellect is the seer of the mind, or Shakti is the seer of the mind. The original consciousness, which is called the witness, Sakshi Chaitanya, is the Drik, the illuminator and the observer. And then who is the seer of this Sakshi Chaitanya? So we came to the very end of the road. There is no seer because this Sakshi Chaitanya is the non-seen seer, non-illumined illuminator. There's nothing beyond consciousness that objectifies and lends anything to consciousness. So consciousness is self-contained, self-luminous, self-existent, and concedes Satchitananda or Satchit to all its objects. So who is the seer of this Shakti? The Shakti is the unobserved observer, okay? So there is no witnessing principle that sees or observes this consciousness. It is the non-observable observer, non-seeable seer, non-experienceable experiencer, non-objectifiable subject, okay? It's the absolute seer, the absolute experiencer, absolute observer, okay? Although in order to see, experience, observe, it requires those relative components of the body-mind complex. So this is the introductory verse, okay? So this is the introductory verse. And in this verse, the author has introduced three observers and three illuminators, three seers. The eye sense organs, he called the number 2, the mind number 3, Sakshi 1. So he presents the Sakshi as the number 1 seer, the mind at number 2, and the it's exactly. I mean, when I unfold this teaching in Portuguese, I was surprised to see that the author has present the 1 sense organs, 2 mind, and 3 Sakshi. So Sakshi consciousness he called the Illuminator number 3 rather than number 1, but it doesn't matter. So he says that 1 and 2 are relative illuminators. Okay. So if we divide in 3, we left out the intellect and we left out the physical instruments of seeing the physical body, okay? So in this analysis here, we say we have 3 aspects. We have Sakshi Chaitanya, and then the mind and the sense organs. So the 1 and 2, meaning to say the sense organs and the mind are relative illuminators. And the number 3, which is consciousness, Satchit, is the absolute illuminator. Thus, the 2 relative Drik and the 1 absolute Drik are the components of the individual. The author feels that this requires further clarification. And the following 4 verses, the first 5 verses, so the following 4 verses are the author's commentaries on the first verse. Each part of the first verse will be elaborated in the following 4 verses. Okay.
Lindo.
Yep.
So the text says that we have the sense organs, like the eyes, we see the example, then the mind. So with the mind, I can see the quality of my seeing, my eyes, of how I see. And then there is Shakshi, that if I understand is something, it's this sense of I that I have, that it's for my mind, because I can see what I think, what I doubt, and so everything of my mind. And so he says that that Shakshi, this Sakshi, I don't know what it's called, we can objectify it, right?
No.
We can realize that it is there, but we cannot, because at the end he talks about like a 4th observer that we cannot objectify, right? Is this right?
To begin with, what he calls Sakshi is pure consciousness, okay? So in some passages on this, he begins this text presenting 4 components, okay? We have Sakshi, which is Chit, which is consciousness, okay? We have consciousness, and then he presents the mind, the sense organs, and then the physical body, the body, okay? So, and there is a transfer being in these 4 components. Now in this analysis, as the seer, okay, he removes the physical body or the physical instruments to see, and says that there is an absolute seer or illuminator, and then the mind and the sense organs, they see, okay, and they experience, okay, and he left out the sense instruments, which is the physical body. Okay, so we have these 2 illuminators, which are relative or secondary, okay, and there is only one that is the absolute seer. Okay, what was your commentary?
my question is, my little doubt is that in the text at the end of the page 5, he says, no, the last 4 words is, who is the seer of the Sakshi? He says that.
Yeah.
So he says that there is a seer of the, it seems that he explains that there is a little distinction between the witness that is behind the mind and the absolute consciousness, because we can realize that there is something that can seize the mind. So we can objectify this Sakshi, but we cannot objectify, how it says here, the Sakshi is the unobserved observer. So it creates a little confusion, because it means that behind the mind we can objectify something, but at the end we cannot objectify it. So it creates a little confusion.
And there is a little confusion because of the words as well. There are two things. One, Sakshi, another name for consciousness, and Shakti. Shakti is energy. Okay, Sakshi is consciousness. Okay, so Sakshi, which is consciousness, is the seer, and it's the number 3 there. Is the absolute seer, which is consciousness. Okay, this consciousness, where they say that cannot be observed, cannot be seen. Where is
at the beginning of page 6? It says the Sakshi is the unobserved observer.
Yeah. So this Sakshi, which is consciousness, is what is the seer, the absolute seer, although it's not an experiencing, knowing entity. This Sakshi is the seer of the intellect and the mind and the sense organs and the physical body. This is the absolute seer, okay? And it's not seen because there is no consciousness beyond consciousness. Consciousness is non-dual, okay?
Okay.
So the Sakshi is the unobserved observer, okay? So there is nothing that can observe consciousness. That's why in this, when teaching comes to this analysis, I like to introduce the intellect, because the intellect is the actual seer of the mind, thoughts, emotions, and so on. You understand? We know that Vedanta makes a clear distinction. The same way the subtle body is being divided with pranas and then organs of perception, then mind. So the intellect is the actual seer of the mind. And there is something that sees the intellect. The intellect is the I thought, okay? And then the intellect is going to see the world. When it sees the world, it experiences the world. It's going to have thoughts in respect to what it sees and perceives, and emotions, okay? So this is the intellect, which is the most final aspect of Jivatma, which I like to define as the very nature, the very definition of Jivatma is this subtle intellect. So this intellect is seeing the mind, the sense organs, and the physical body, and through the physical body seeing the world. But this intellect is still this subtle meditator, the subtle intellect. It is the seer, but it's seen by something else. This thing that sees the intellect and the mind and the sense organs is not an experiencing seer. It is a non-experiencing seer. It's a non-experiencing illuminator, okay? But without this seer, without this illuminator, the intellect cannot transfer sentience to the mind, and the mind to the sense organs, and the sense organs to the physical instruments, okay? Does it take care of your confusion?
Yes, totally. Thank you.
Okay, anything from you, Mark?
I was listening to this and thinking with regards to the Mandukya Upanishad and how the Sakshi lends consciousness through the different 3 states. And obviously, we're talking about the waking state in this one. And then I was thinking it would obviously stop lending consciousness to the body, to the sense instruments in the dream state. And then in the deep sleep state, it would just lend consciousness to the mind in a very subtle form. So this was where my mind was working while you were explaining that.
Yeah, it's a different teaching. Consciousness is the absolute illuminator, and as we know, even in deep sleep, it illumines, transfer its conscious existence through a different medium there, which is not part of this analysis here, which is the causal body. So it illumines the causal body, and then the causal body, which is the most subtle expression, of the individual soul, it's going to experience the absence of experience, so to speak, duality, and but consciousness is there, even though it's there, transferring its conscious existence to the causal body, but the causal body does not have the reflectivity or reflection that allows the I thought to appear. And with the I thought, there is the thought about the environment, and not having the I thought, there is no thought of the environment. One experience a sense of peace and limitlessness. So it is definitely a different teaching, but it's this transfer. Any teaching we see, you will see that there is this transferring or landing of Satchit that comes all the way from Brahman to all aspects of the body-mind complex, until this body-mind complex illumines and knows and experiences the world.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay, so we carry on next week. Okay, and thank you. Nice to be with you. We meet again Monday with Panchadas. Yeah. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you, my friend. Thank you a lot. Talk to you soon again. Namaste.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Thanks. Bye now.
Thank you, Mark.